Welcome back to Philosophy and Ethics in Games, the series where I break down the stories in some of our favorite games and ask the tough questions to figure out what is right and what is wrong. I'm Josh Bearheart Hawk, and today we're beginning our journey through the world of The Last of Us Part 1. In case you missed any of the previous episodes in the Philosophy and Ethics series, I've linked a playlist in the description below. As I continue to break down this and other games, I'll add new videos to the playlist so you can find them all in one place. The Last of Us Part 1 was originally released in 2013 by Sony Computer Entertainment after being developed by Naughty Dog. It was originally a PlayStation exclusive and received glowing reviews, and has since been released on several other platforms and was remastered for the PlayStation 5 and PC in 2022. Over the next few weeks, we'll be breaking down the story and characters from the game. But before we start, I want to lay out a few things about the Philosophy and Ethics in Games series for those who may be finding the series for the first time. In the Philosophy and Ethics in Games series, we take a critical look at the stories in games and try to think about them in terms of the real world and use them as thought experiments to learn about ourselves and the world we live in. Based on some of the feedback I've gotten from prior breakdowns of games like The Walking Dead, The Wolf Among Us, Fallout 4, Grand Theft Auto 5, and others, I feel it's important to point out that while I may occasionally share my opinion on various aspects of the game and the writing, the primary focus of Philosophy and Ethics in Games is to try and view our favorite games through a new lens that hasn't been used before on other breakdowns and review channels here on YouTube. Think of this as a lecture series you might find on a really fun university campus. In this particular breakdown, I will only be looking at The Last of Us Part 1 and its DLC, Left Behind. There may be things that I leave out or ignore that were addressed in the sequel, The Last of Us Part 2. And that is intentional, because while there are ethical and moral systems that look at the consequences of choices made to determine right and wrong, most of what we will be looking at in Part 1 is self-contained. If you would like to see a breakdown of Part 2, let me know in the comments. If there's enough interest, I'll prioritize breaking down that game as well in the near future. So with that out of the way, let's get started with The Last of Us Part 1. The main story for The Last of Us Part 1 starts in what could be more or less the modern day. Within the first few minutes, we meet Joel, the man who will become the main player protagonist throughout the game, and Sarah, Joel's daughter, who will wind up being tragically killed as things start to really ramp up. Sarah is sleeping on the couch, having fallen asleep while waiting on Joel to get home from a long day at work. And we get a pretty good picture of the kind of relationship they have and who they are pretty quick. It's clear that Sarah's mother is out of the picture for one reason or another, and Joel is doing his best to juggle being both a mom and a dad while also working to provide for himself and his daughter. This is a situation many families in our own world are all too familiar with, and instantly makes them extremely relatable. Joel seems a little stressed out, and he gets on Sarah's case for being up so late. But she quickly livens the mood by offering him a birthday present that she managed to get for him in the form of a watch. It's clear that these two have come to not only depend on one another, but have a close father-daughter bond, and while we can see where the storytelling is going, I want to focus on something a little more real. While Joel is Sarah's father, he also treats her almost as an equal, as evidenced by their banter in this opening scene. Sarah is clearly mature for her age, and it's nice to see a situation in media like this where the parent actually respects their kid as an individual rather than just looking down on them as a child. Often, both in media and the real world, parents have a habit of viewing their children as nothing more than kids who should be following instructions and only doing what they're told, rather than as thinking, feeling individuals that have their own desires, ideas, and rights. This is an old-school mentality that goes back decades at least, and winds up causing more harm than anything else. The goal as a parent should be to raise kids that actually think critically about the world around them and strive to make the best decisions possible in every situation. The kind of parenting that relies on punishments and the do-as-I-say mentality leads to robots that follow orders blindly without thinking, or leads to teens and young adults that rebel against what they see as an oppressive system. There are even entire industries built around dealing with rebellious teens and teaching parents how to properly discipline their children to stop them from lashing out against the parents' authority. In reality, when parents treat their children with respect and dignity and trust them to make good decisions because they've been shown how to do that and had it modeled through the parents' behavior, things tend to work out better overall for both the parents and the kids. There are fewer arguments, and the kids grow into adults who know how to manage their emotions and make better decisions in tough situations. And this isn't just something that I made up, as there have been numerous studies done on parenting styles and what works the best overall when it comes to raising kids. In general, an authoritative style of parenting, where the parents treat the child with respect and care while setting clear boundaries and communicating properly with them, results in a more well-adjusted, higher-achieving child who becomes a well-rounded adult. Obviously, the results can vary, and there is still the debate about nature versus nurture to be had. But just generally speaking, it's better to treat kids like human beings than to treat them as soulless husks that should just do whatever they're told all the time. Getting back into the story, Sarah and Joel soon find themselves dealing with the unthinkable as the world outside their little home starts falling apart. There has been some kind of outbreak linked to tainted crops, with a few people seemingly going crazy, and it's apparently gotten much worse in the days leading up to the start of the game. Sarah is woken up by a call from her uncle in the middle of the night, and after wandering the house for a bit looking for Joel, she finds him coming in the back door in a panicked state. He's being pursued by their neighbor, who seems to have gone crazy himself, and as much as he tries to avoid shooting the man, in the end he has no choice. It's also worth mentioning that the TV in Joel's room was tuned to the news, with some kind of massive fire being the focus of the coverage, and putting two and two together, we can kind of figure out that society is collapsing around us. That might be a big leap to make just based on the news coverage, but when you're faced with a crazed neighbor, a massive explosion in town, and chaos erupting on the streets, it's a pretty safe bet things are going to change in a big way. But before we move on and follow Joel and Sarah out onto the streets, I just have to be a little bit nitpicky because Sarah can find and look at Joel's cell phone on the counter in the kitchen, and there were a couple of minor details that stood out to me and just hit the part of my brain that can't let go of things. For one thing, all of this is happening at 1:47 in the morning, and Joel's brother Tommy is messaging him like it's the middle of the day. I don't know about you, but I put my cell phone on bedtime mode overnight, and there isn't anything that's getting through that. The more annoying thing, though, aside from the 35% battery remaining when he should have been charging his phone overnight, is that Tommy's text saying that he was on his way, presumably to Joel's house, was followed up with a text that asked him where he was and said to call him. That could be a realistic thing, though it makes me wonder if Tommy was texting while he drove over there, or if it was just a mess up in the presentation, as having the more recent text on the bottom would make way more sense to me. But that's all just kind of nitpicky and not really important overall. Getting back to the more important things, Joel and Sarah leave the house and join Tommy, who's just arrived in his SUV, as they attempt to escape the area. In reality, this is an incredibly dumb decision because they have no idea what's going on, and leaving the relative safety of the house is just asking for trouble. As a general rule, unless there is a standing evacuation order like something preceding or following a natural disaster, and so long as there isn't any kind of immediate threat like a house fire, it's better to shelter in place until you have more information about the situation the rest of the world is in. Flooding onto the streets just adds to the chaos and panic and makes it harder for authorities to get a handle on whatever is going on. In this situation, Joel, Sarah, and Tommy should have just hunkered down and stayed where they were, at least until daybreak, and assessed things from there. It's also good to be as prepared as you can be for these kinds of situations, having backstocks of things like food, water, toilet paper, and an emergency radio. If possible, you want to have a few days worth of supplies in case you can't get out of wherever you're located. This doesn't mean that you need to have a bunker and years of food, but it does mean trying to keep at least a little extra food and water on hand whenever you can. I'll highlight this with a personal example from the pandemic, as something I always kept stocked up on was toilet paper. It's something I usually try to have on hand, with a couple months worth just chilling in the laundry room at all times. In early 2020, when that particular item was out of stock at every store in the world because people were flocking out and buying it in droves, I had enough on hand to last through the panic and never really had to worry. That's kind of a silly example, but you get the point. Try to stay as stocked as you can when you can, because you never know what kind of crazy stuff might happen in the world, and it's better to be a little prepared than to have nothing at all. Joel, Sarah, and Tommy find out pretty quickly just how bad of an idea leaving was as they wind up in an accident, putting them on foot among the other panicked people in town as things start to spiral out of control. Tommy winds up holding off some of the zombified crazy people as Joel and Sarah make a run for the freeway. And there is one more moment that we have to talk about as Joel and Sarah come face to face with a soldier who should be their saving grace, but winds up being an addition to their nightmare. This soldier will wind up opening fire on them, killing Sarah and wounding Joel before Tommy takes him out. But that is absolutely the wrong move on his part. Now, at first glance, it could be justified given the circumstances based on the ethical principle of utilitarianism, which will actually be a major point of discussion throughout the game. But in this situation, he could have and probably should have disobeyed orders, as Joel and Ellie weren't really a threat. Sure, he might not have been able to bring them back to wherever his group was set up, but he and they were all alone in that area and he could have told them to go back the way they came. Joel might not have liked that answer, but it would have been far better than opening fire on a man and his daughter like he does. And, in fact, the order to shoot them would fall into unlawful territory as they didn't pose an immediate threat to anyone's safety. It could be argued that there was a standing order to shoot anyone on sight because they might be infected, and we don't know how much the military or anyone knew about the infection at that point. But at least in the real world, there is no circumstance where any member of the military should be shooting unarmed civilians. I can say that as a veteran of the United States Army. Even if there was some kind of infection or outbreak that needed to be contained, unless there was an active, imminent threat posed, there is no legal justification to shoot them. That aside, the soldier blindly follows his orders, and Sarah is killed in the attack. Joel is devastated, but while Sarah's story might end there, his story carries on into a frightening new world. 20 years later, Joel finds himself living in a quarantine zone in the ruins of what used to be Boston, Massachusetts. He's changed quite a bit, and as we'll find out in the long term, he never really dealt with the grief of losing Sarah. He's living alone, and with very few exceptions, he doesn't really seem to have anyone in his life that he cares about. The one person we do see him show at least a little warmth toward is a woman named Tess, who wakes him up by pounding at his door early one summer morning. Tess and Joel are partners, and may have a loose romantic connection, but all we really know at this point is that the pair of them seem to be working as smugglers. When we first meet Tess, she's returning from delivering pills, either medicine or illicit drugs, to someone across town. And we learn that while the drop-off went fine, she was attacked on the way back by a couple of men working for someone named Robert. To make a long story short, and as simple as possible, the Zone is more or less an authoritarian wet dream society where the military, or what's left of them, runs things, and people are required to show their papers to prove that they belong, while also waiting in line for rations and being subjected to constant checks to see if they're infected or not. While something like that might be fine for some people, with the value of the safety provided outweighing the desire to freely move about and live in the way you want to, it isn't a community that I would personally want to be a part of. Maybe you get to go on breathing, and your heart is still pumping, but in that kind of world, you aren't ever really living. People are ordered to do what they are told, when they are told, and if they don't go along, they wind up dead or exiled. Meanwhile, though the game doesn't really show this, I would be willing to bet that the guys at the top of the ladder are living it up with more than enough food and medicine. I say that because it's a pretty common thing to see in these kinds of dystopian environments, but also because that's the way things go in real-life authoritarian regimes. There is always a guy or group of guys at the top who convince everyone below them to just go along with things while promising safety from all that you might fear. That's really kind of besides the point here, though, as we aren't directly fighting an authoritarian regime in The Last of Us Part 1. At least not an obvious one. See, there is a group that is actively fighting against the authorities in Boston and elsewhere, known as the Fireflies. They formed up shortly after the fall of the government, or perhaps a little earlier, and their main goal appears to be getting society back on its feet, regardless of the cost. The first time we see anything to do with them, outside of a mention in the opening credits, is when they blow up a military vehicle at one of the quarantine zone gates as Joel and Tess are on their way to see Robert. Now, before we go any further, I feel it's prudent to mention that when I do these kind of breakdowns, I mainly stick to what I see and discover throughout the game. So when I talk about these characters and their roles, I'm going from what I observe rather than information gathered from wikis and other places. This is mainly because I want the experience to be based on whatever the developers presented without outside influence, and because at the end of the day, these breakdowns are focused on aspects outside of the game world rather than any lore or established rules in the game. I bring that up because when it comes to Robert, I honestly have no clue who he actually is to Joel and Tess here. From the context in the game, he appears to be the leader of a faction that they trade with or compete with when it comes to smuggling things, but I'm not sure it's ever really spelled out, though I might have just missed it. In these kind of instances, just know that the part that we're focused on is the ethical, philosophical, and moral workings, and the lore isn't really important for that angle. What is important is that Robert apparently sold a shipment of guns that he was supposed to be delivering to Joel and Tess. That shipment was meant to pay off some kind of debt that he had with them, and now they're expecting payment in full when he has nothing left to give them. To make matters worse, he sold the guns to the Fireflies, meaning the likelihood of Joel and Tess getting them back is low. Annoyed with Robert's stupidity and not willing to put up with his groveling, Tess decides to just shoot him. And as wild as that is, I have to say it's actually kind of refreshing to see characters in a game that don't put up with the crap and are willing to do what needs to be done. That's not saying that Robert necessarily deserved to be shot. We don't really know the guy outside of this interaction, and he could have been a saint that fed soup to dying senior citizens on the weekends for all we know. It's just one of those things where the supposed good guys seem to always be against killing, even when it does make sense, and knowing that we're rolling into a situation where that isn't the case is kind of refreshing. That being said, it turns out getting the guns back won't be quite as complicated as Joel and Tess assumed it would be, as within minutes of killing Robert, they are greeted by the leader of the local Fireflies and offered a deal. Marlene is going to be a rather interesting character to talk about in this series, and she'll likely get her own Friend or Foe episode at some point. But for now, the only thing we need to concern ourselves with is that she is the leader of the Fireflies in Boston. Or what's left of the Fireflies, that is. They're mostly wiped out thanks to raids being done by the military, and Marlene is getting desperate. So desperate, in fact, that she is willing to part with the guns that she bought from Robert if Joel and Tess can just help her smuggle one package out of the city. That package isn't exactly what you might have been expecting, however, as it turns out to be a 14-year-old girl named Ellie. She can't share why Ellie needs to be smuggled, only that the girl needs to be delivered to a group of Fireflies outside the safe zone at the old Capitol building. But this is a good time to talk about human smuggling. Not a line I ever expected to utter, but here we are. See, the concept of smuggling human beings has a long and often sordid history that includes both good reasons, like freeing people from slavery on the Underground Railroad, and bad reasons, like trafficking people through various criminal enterprises and treating them as property. Some people might think they are above the human beings they are trafficking, and they often see them as nothing more than chattel. I would hope, if you've made it this far into a video discussing philosophy and ethics, that I wouldn't need to explain to you why this concept is wrong morally and ethically. But if you feel the need to defend it in the comments, just do us all a favor and don't. There are some points I bring up in these videos that are up for debate, and there are some things where I draw the line because there is no discussion or middle ground to be had. Even in these instances, though, I bring up the topics because we should really be looking at what is actually happening in the games and how those things fall in with real-world topics and themes. We can even learn a surprising amount about history and the world we live in by asking questions like, how does smuggling Ellie tie into events in the world historically? We'll find out shortly that she was bitten by one of the zombie things that inhabit the world, and that she didn't turn like everyone else, convincing Marlene that Ellie is immune and meaning that she could possibly be the answer to the cure the Fireflies have been desperately seeking. The idea here is that if anyone else found out about her, she would be at risk of being targeted and killed because there are a lot of people who don't want a cure and would do anything to prevent any possibility of that happening. Toss aside for a moment the absurdity of her being the only one to ever not have the infection take hold, as there are likely others out there who would killed before they found out they wouldn't show symptoms, or who flew under the radar and were never discovered. And the closest analog we can find, historically, to something like her situation would be people escaping slavery through the Underground Railroad. This secret organization operated between the southern United States and Canada from around the 1780s until the conclusion of the war between the states in the 1860s. Escaped slaves were high-value targets in many places because the plantation owners would offer large rewards for the return of what they saw as their property. One of the most well-known and most impactful members of the Underground Railroad was Harriet Tubman, who spent years escorting over 300 people along the route north to freedom. She herself was a former slave, who gained her freedom after escaping a plantation in 1849. And she would make multiple trips back south after the Fugitive Slave Act was passed in 1850 to help free and escort others north. Other key figures include people like Stephen Myers, who led the Underground Railroad from the 1830s to 1850s, William Henry Johnson, who worked tirelessly as an advocate for slaves and former slaves while also fighting in the Union Army in the Battle of Bull Run and others, and Lydia and Abigail Mott, a pair of Quaker sisters who worked as operators on the Underground Railroad in the Albany, New York area. This list isn't exhaustive, and you should definitely take the time to dig into the history of the Underground Railroad when this video ends because it is truly fascinating and remarkable to consider how much the people behind it did and how much was on the line for them if they were caught. In a similar way, Joel and Tess are putting a lot on the line when it comes to smuggling Ellie, as everything about what they are doing is illegal, and their success could potentially mean saving lives. It's also notable that they aren't doing it out of the goodness of their hearts, but that topic of conversation will be brought up later again in the series. The journey itself to the capital is far from easy, and I'll just say here that it was actually really kind of frustrating for me from a gameplay standpoint, as I really didn't like what felt like a maze at times when I was trying to get where we needed to go. This is a personal gameplay objection, but I can't be the only one who wasn't a fan of the sneaking around in the first few parts of the game. Honestly, I'm not sure I would have even given it a fair chance if I wasn't recording it for the Philosophy and Ethics series. Once I got used to the mechanics and dealing with the various zombies and NPCs, it wasn't too bad, but in this first section I wanted nothing more than to advance the story and was in way too much of a hurry. I went into the game mostly blind, having only a basic knowledge that it was set in a post-apocalyptic world and that I would be helping Ellie get somewhere, and I think my expectation was that the story would be much more cutscene driven. In reality, there was a lot to take in and explore, and I had to really learn to slow things down and be more observant before I could really enjoy myself. And I need to praise the world design here as well, because it was really cool to see Boston, and eventually other cities, overgrown and looking like I expect post-apocalyptic worlds to look. This was what I expected out of other games like The Walking Dead or Fallout 4 in a way, But those settings weren't really anything like The Last of Us, and I need to give some mad props to Naughty Dog for building such a beautiful world. Jumping down off that soapbox, we can follow Joel, Ellie, and Tess as they end their journey at the Capitol building, only to find the Fireflies they expect to meet dead. It wasn't really clear to me what happened, but there wasn't even much time to focus on it because the military showed up and forced the crew to leave. Well, 2 of them at least. See, on the trip to the Capitol, Tess actually got bitten by one of the zombies that we encountered, and she doesn't appear too confident that she'll have the same luck as Ellie. Saying goodbye, Tess stays behind to hold off the incoming soldiers as Joel and Ellie make their way out of the rotunda and into the next episode of Philosophy and Ethics in Games. Welcome back to Philosophy and Ethics in Games, the series where I break down the stories in some of our favorite games and ask the tough questions to figure out what is right and what is wrong. I'm Josh Bearheart Hawk, and today we're continuing our march west with Joel and Ellie in The Last of Us Part 1. In case you missed any of the previous episodes in the Philosophy and Ethics series, I've linked a playlist in the description below. As I continue to break down this and other games, I'll add new videos to the playlist so you can find them all in one place. After being bitten on the way to the Capitol building, Tess decided to sacrifice herself in order to give Joel and Ellie some time to escape the incoming military. It was a noble gesture, but kind of a hollow one at the end of the day, as the pair still have to get through the building and avoid the patrols that are now swarming the area, and bringing me to the first thing I want to discuss. It's a pretty common trope in games, and one that kind of makes sense from a gameplay perspective, to have waves of enemies to either defeat or evade. This is obviously done to add some action to games in places where things might otherwise be too boring for most players. But even so, it's one of those things that just drives me crazy in these kind of games in particular. I talked a bit in the first episode about how I was annoyed with the sneaking around in the first couple of hours as it took me some time to get used to. But this isn't even about that, as the idea that these soldiers would be swarming the building looking for Joel and Ellie is actually kind of wild. The best explanation I can come up with is that they somehow knew there were fireflies there, killed them, and then just sat back and watched the area for others that might show up. If that's the case, though, it kind of makes things even worse because it falls into another concept that always bothered me in these post-apocalyptic kind of games. When covering Telltale Games' The Walking Dead, there were a couple of episodes I picked on for their representation of rebuilding society and what that would wind up being like. The problem I see in those games, as well as in The Last of Us and others, is that while the idea of society just falling and never rebuilding makes for some great sci-fi, it isn't wholly realistic when you consider the nature of human beings and the fact that we built society in the first place. See, while the modern luxuries would go away in the event of something like the cordyceps outbreak or some other massive collapse, the basic tenets of humanity and the ability to cooperate and work in groups that has brought us this far would still be there. We might lose electricity, indoor plumbing, organized farming, and mass-produced everything, but at the end of the day, we'd still be a social species and would still thrive best when working together. Where this comes in with regard to The Last of Us is in the fact that Joel and Ellie are in a world that is 20 years into the collapse of the modern world, and in which there shouldn't be the same shoot first, ask questions later mentality that would exist in the first few months of the event. People 20 years into this thing would have settled into a new norm, which we kind of see in the Boston Safe Zone. But the highly militarized and dystopian way that things are done just isn't realistic. That's mainly because that way of doing things goes against the cooperative social structure that humanity has thrived on for millennia. While we do tend to fight others as a means of survival, the people experiencing life in the post-cordyceps world would have some memory and idea of what the world was like before and would be more apt to understand that not everyone is a threat. And 20 years into things, many of the early threats from groups of people like raiders would have slowly fizzled out because those kind of societies aren't sustainable for more than a few months at a time, as the lack of trust, or honor among thieves, causes those more anarchistic societies to fall apart. If you can't trust the people that you are sleeping close to not kill you and rob you in your sleep, you either kill them or you leave as soon as you can. Those groups would also run out of targets rather quickly, causing the turn to happen before many of them could even really get organized. So while the soldiers in the game might rightly assume Joel and Ellie are hostiles running with the Fireflies or a group of raiders, the reality is that the likelihood of that in a real-life scenario would be low, and the soldiers would be more likely to round them up and question them than to just shoot them. It's even pretty likely that by that point in time there would be established trade routes between various settlements and groups, and that Joel, Ellie, and Tess would just have been able to walk right out the front gate of Boston with no issues. But, of course, that would make for a boring game in most people's eyes, and as Joel and Ellie emerge from a tunnel, we find ourselves walking with them as Joel himself becomes the topic of discussion. In the first video covering The Last of Us Part 1, we briefly touched on Joel and his inability to process the grief of his daughter's death over the 20-year span from the start of the game to the present day. It turns out Joel's problem isn't just with losing Sarah, though. It's with processing emotions and having anything close to human feelings other than anger. The first thing he does is tell Ellie to more or less shut up and do as she's told. He doesn't want to talk about what happened with Tess, and all he wants to do is figure out how to get rid of what he sees as nothing more than a package with no destination. First things first, grief is one of those things that makes people do some crazy shit, for lack of a better way to put it. We've seen characters in the games that we've covered do things that make no sense at all because they were holding in grief or pretending things were fine when they really weren't. And that is about the worst thing that you can do. In some ways, the idea of hiding your grief is a generational concept, with older men specifically trying to pretend that they have no emotions and even going out of their way to avoid showing anything other than a stoic face, even in the most tragic of circumstances. This is something, especially in Western society, that is drilled into boys from the time they are very little and winds up causing them more harm than good in the long run. I can remember being 5 or 6 years old and getting scolded for crying and told to suck it up when I got hurt because boys don't cry. As I grew older, I started to realize how asinine that line of thinking truly was and how much bottling my emotions over the years had cost me. Trying to take in loss and grieve in private alienates you from others and leads to both physical and mental health problems that can drive you to an early grave. One of the most important things I discovered as an adult was that opening up to others, and especially those who are closest to you, and talking about painful memories and events from your life helps those things become less painful and leads to improved well-being and higher overall happiness. Even just sharing those things with one other person helps lighten your burden and can provide an amazing level of relief. In Joel's case, the best thing he could do would be to open up to Ellie about what happened and discuss things instead of locking her out and treating her as if Tessa's death was her fault. And this scene, along with others we'll visit later on, shows us something that isn't talked about very often but should be a lot more common in these kind of discussions: emotional intelligence. Most people have heard of IQ, the measure of a person's general intelligence, but not as many people have heard of EQ, the measure of how emotionally mature a person is. People who have a high emotional intelligence are good at recognizing and managing their own emotions, and are often more empathetic and better at managing external relationships than those who have a lower EQ. They are also typically better at voicing when something is wrong and talking through problems that others might see as impossible to overcome. Applying this concept to Joel and Ellie, Ellie shows a much higher EQ than Joel throughout the course of the game, as she is able to manage her emotions and talk things through, while also recognizing when something is wrong with Joel and working to find ways to get him to open up. Joel, on the other hand, is very closed off and confrontational, and while he does open up some as the game goes on, he never really gets where he needs to be. And that's an important point to focus on, because EQ, like IQ, is fluid and can be improved with work and practice. learning about self-regulation of emotions, taking the time to reflect inward, and identifying your own strengths and weaknesses while working to improve yourself in the long run are all ways you can raise your EQ. For instance, Joel could take the time to realize and reflect on why he shuts down like he does when Tess dies, and think about how his actions and reactions to events like that might impact the people around him, like Ellie. He could also work in the future to take a step back when he knows his temper is getting the better of him and try to think carefully before he speaks so he doesn't wind up saying anything he might regret. That last point will come up again later in the story, so keep an eye out. Joel and Ellie make their way into the town of Lincoln, Massachusetts, where the plan is to meet up with Joel's old friend Bill and hopefully commandeer a car to help them get out to Wyoming, where Joel's brother Tommy lives. As they explore the town and search for Bill, we can find a sign instructing all residents of Amherst County to evacuate and head to a quarantine zone. This is obviously a relic of days long gone, but it highlights something that we touched on in the previous video regarding disaster preparedness and the poor response the authorities had at the beginning of the outbreak. To be fair, the cordyceps outbreak was unlike anything anyone had ever seen before, but the reason no one was prepared for it boils down more to the cost versus risk analysis than some innate problem with the scale. See, humans in general are hardwired to only see and react to immediate threats, and planning for possible threats takes extra effort. That effort might come in the form of extra time and energy expended, but in the modern world it usually takes the shape of a cost-benefit analysis for specific risks and threats, and if the cost of preparing for or trying to prevent something is higher than the risk associated with that thing actually occurring, the individuals, businesses, or governments making the plans will often just note the risk and move on rather than preparing for it. This is smart in that it saves resources, but in the worst-case scenario, it can actually be very costly. In the case of the quarantine safe zones in the game, this lack of planning becomes abundantly clear as we find out through exploration of several of them that there wasn't enough food or space for the number of people who needed help. The government didn't see the cost of stockpiling months' worth of food for thousands of people as cost-effective because the risk of an event like the cordyceps outbreak was so low. And if they had been preparing for it properly, there would have been groups of people asking what they knew but weren't sharing, or calling them out as wasteful since they were preparing for something so random. It's a no-win situation, and it's really hard to blame them for not being 100% ready. On the other hand, there is an argument to be made when it comes to their decision to shoot people, as we'll find out later on that many people were killed in the streets as a means to prevent the spread and because of the lack of preparedness. Joel saw this firsthand with the soldier that he ran into in the beginning of the outbreak, but many more people had it far worse as entire families were slaughtered trying to get into the safe zones. We'll once again bring up utilitarian principles here because the idea that the needs of the many outweigh the needs of the few is a popular one, and would have been the justification handed down from superior officers as they ordered their subordinates to shoot unarmed civilians. The radio would have sprung to life, with the voice of a commander coming over to say something like, "We need to stop the spread of the virus. If we don't kill those banging on the gates, we'll all die, including the civilians we've already let in." I brought up in the first video how important it is to be prepared for a disaster scenario, and this situation just drives that idea home as the panic would have been far less and the government might have been able to keep some form of order if more people had been prepared and sheltered in place. Now, I do have to point out here that the government did screw up as they were ordering people to quarantine zones and even going door to door in order to evacuate people, creating a bigger mess than was needed. Meaning sheltering in place in this scenario would have been incredibly difficult. But that's something that would need to be addressed in the planning stages we talked about just a moment ago. The messaging in general from the government should be aimed at encouraging people to be prepared for disasters, and evacuation efforts should have been limited to the most needy in the situation. In general, staying hunkered in their houses would have been far better for most people. This wasn't some natural disaster where homes were destroyed. It was an outbreak where people would have been better off practicing social distancing than crowding into a safe zone. It is worth noting here that we've actually lived through a version of this with the 2020 pandemic, and we've seen the effect of messaging and the reaction of people being locked down. While some people are just ignorant and will refuse to do the right thing out of spite, many people will listen when the importance of the situation is explained and when a proper plan is in place. But some people do spend time preparing and will even do everything in their power to avoid going to things like quarantine zones. Sometimes they'll prepare way ahead of time and keep their families safe. And sometimes they're just looking out for themselves and want nothing more than to be left alone. Enter Bill. As Joel and Ellie move through the town of Lincoln, they encounter several traps that slow them down and even nearly kill them, as Joel steps into a snare at one point that hangs him upside down as a herd of zombies relentlessly attacks. These traps are the work of a man named Bill, an acquaintance of Joel's from years prior, who was a bit of a survivalist and mechanic prior to the fall of society. Bill is a bit of a loner, choosing to avoid any kind of meaningful connection with the outside world. And his way of doing things is both beneficial and a huge risk. On the one hand, being alone means that you don't need to worry about anyone else making mistakes that could compromise your home base. And it means that you need less supplies overall, as the risk of injury is limited to just yourself and you only have one mouth to feed. A cache of food or medical supplies can last longer than it would when split among 2 or more people. And any kind of emergency or nearby disturbance becomes a little less worrisome when you don't have to wonder if one of your compatriots is involved. On the other hand, you don't have anyone to watch your back, and an accident or injury that might have been manageable with help could wind up being the end of your life. There's also a benefit to spreading the workload around when trying to secure an area and keep an eye out for threats, as one person can sleep while the other keeps watch when needed. In reality, though, the truth actually comes back to the discussion we had in the first video of this series about the quality of life. Sure, your heart might go on beating, and you might be able to draw breath for longer being on your own, but is it really worth it? Are you really living if you don't have anyone to share a conversation or a laugh with? As we discussed earlier, humans are a social species, and even those among us who prefer some alone time need some kind of social interaction to keep from going crazy. That might come in the form of an animal companion or 1 or 2 other people, but going too long on your own without having someone to talk to isn't good for your mental well-being. Even Bill needs the occasional interaction, and as much as he tries to pretend he isn't happy to see Joel, he is willing to help him and Ellie out, and the trio make their way to an old school where Bill is pretty sure he can get a battery off a wrecked truck to power one of the possibly workable abandoned cars in the area. Over the course of that trip, they wind up running into a lot of zombies, which is kind of weird to be honest, as Bill seems like the kind of person that would have cleared out the local threats. And we see the effect of spending so much time alone on Bill as he talks to himself pretty regularly. His little one-on-one chats aren't the first time we see a little bit of mental instability setting in with him though, as we're able to find some of his notes to himself prior to meeting him, and I almost feel a little sorry for him as no one should be that lonely. It turns out he wasn't always lonely though, as he admits to Joel in a conversation that he once had someone that he cared about before supposedly realizing that caring about others was simply a fast track to getting yourself killed. We'll find out in short order that he's only sharing a half-truth there, and it shows that Joel isn't the only one in the game that could become a little more self-aware and stand to grow his EQ a little bit. Reaching the school and dealing with hordes of infected, the group finds the truck battery has already been taken and ends up having to fight their way out before finally taking shelter in a nearby house, where we learn a little more about Bill and his former partner, a man named Frank. It turns out Frank and Bill had some kind of big argument, and Frank decided to steal the battery from the truck to power his means of escape from the area. He was able to get the battery, but he found himself bitten in the process and decided to end his own life rather than become one of the monsters that roam the streets. Before he passed away, he left a note letting Bill know how angry he was, And reading between the lines, we can guess that they were pretty close at one point, as he talks about being tired of Bill's set-in-ways attitude and wanting more out of life than Bill could know. If nothing else, this whole thing should be used as a reminder that we should never take the moments that we get in life for granted. Bill refused to change and wound up pushing Frank away, ending with Frank making the decision to try and leave on his own and getting himself killed in the process. If Bill had only been more open to the possibilities in the world and worked together with Frank, Frank might still be alive, and the pair might be out exploring together. Bill tries to brush it off as no big deal when Joel hands him the letter. But if I had to bet, I'd say he's probably going to be crying his eyes out once Joel and Ellie are gone. They both used anger to mask their true feelings and to avoid admitting that the other one might have been right about one thing or another. And while Frank doesn't have to deal with those feelings anymore, Bill has a long battle ahead of him. All of that aside, the trio are able to get the pickup truck in the garage of the house moving, and before long, Joel and Bill are saying farewell as Bill heads back to his empty home and Joel and Ellie head west. But they don't make it as far as they were hoping, as they hit a snag in Pittsburgh that nearly ends their journey completely. Joel recognizes the ambush before it even gets going, but the fallout of that will have to wait for next week. Welcome back to Philosophy and Ethics in Games, the series where I break down the stories in some of our favorite games and ask the tough questions to figure out what is right and what is wrong. I'm Josh Bearheart Hawk, and today we're making some new friends and enemies with Joel and Ellie in The Last of Us Part 1. In case you missed any of the previous episodes in the Philosophy and Ethics series, I've linked a playlist in the description below. As I continue to break down this and other games, I'll add new videos to the playlist so you can find them all in one place. After leaving Bill behind at the end of the last episode, Joel and Ellie wound up running into an ambush in the messy streets of Pittsburgh. Joel recognized the attempted robbery before the raiders were able to do much more than get in the way of the truck, but seeing the danger coming doesn't always mean avoiding it, and in the blink of an eye, the pair found themselves fighting for survival against a gang of ruthless bandits. These guys are your typical nameless, faceless bad guys, and they fit right into the mold we talked about in the last episode of the kinds of bandits that wouldn't last long as a group in the real world. They spend their time planning ambushes and robbing people who are unfortunate enough to be passing through downtown Pittsburgh, and they likely live by the old, outdated idea of survival of the fittest. And that's an idea that's worth spending some time on, because while its origins have some merit, the version most people are talking about when it's brought up goes back to a fundamental misunderstanding of biology and speciation. The phrase survival of the fittest was first coined by a man named Herbert Spencer in his 1864 book Principles of Biology, as a way to describe what he saw as a connection between social hierarchies and Charles Darwin's relatively new idea of the evolution of species by means of natural selection. Spencer tried to apply the idea of natural selection to society writ large, as well as other places where it didn't really make sense. And his writings would go on to help fuel the fire of eugenics, among other movements, in the late 19th century and on into the 20th. From the standpoint of Darwinian evolution, the phrase actually makes some sense, and even Darwin used it in his 1869 version of Origin of Species, in addition to the more commonly used phrase natural selection. At a very high level, as you should have at least been exposed to evolution in your high school biology class, natural selection, when it comes to genes, describes the change in the frequency of alleles over time in a population. Basically, certain traits might be retained, lost, or changed over generations within a group of individuals. These changes are random, but those that don't hinder the chance for an individual to reproduce have a higher chance of being passed on and becoming more common. People like Spencer and the subsequent eugenics movement took this idea and applied it as a kind of active force within society and the world around us, to ostensibly argue that the strongest survive and get their rewards while the weaker perish and deserve their suffering. Different versions of this idea have been applied to things like social and economic status, where people who have less in society are seen as weak and pathetic because they just don't want to work hard enough. and to justify hoarding wealth, and even things like the idea of trickle-down economics introduced in the 1980s by Ronald Reagan. Groups like the raiders we meet in The Last of Us, as well as other games, seem to want to live by this idea overall as well, deciding that their ability to kill and take advantage of people means that they have a right to do so. This could even be summed up into a single phrase that has been used to justify some of the most horrific atrocities in human history: might makes right. But that idea doesn't flow both ways, as the minute the person who is at the top meets their match and falls, they suddenly recognize the error of their ways, or even ignore the concept completely, like we see later on in the game with another villain we'll meet in a couple of weeks. The crowd that lives by the might makes right idea typically wind up falling because of their hubris, thinking that they are the biggest and baddest around and that no one could ever touch them. The raiders Joel and Ellie run into in Pittsburgh likely thought they had planned for every possible problem, and we can even find a map where they drew up exactly how to ambush people in different areas, showing how far they went with this whole thing. On the surface, that might make them seem like they were really smart, as planning things out is usually a good idea, but in reality, it just shows how dumb they truly were. If they had put the same amount of effort and planning into growing their own food and building a sustainable community, they would have flourished in the long run. They are 20 years into the fall of society. They cannot reasonably expect to be able to rob and kill people forever and be able to last. It's also important to note something else here that is tangentially related, as I said earlier, that Joel recognized the ambush before it even got started. And there's a good reason for that. Joel used to be one of those kinds of raiders. He avoids the questions Ellie has about the subject, but it's implied that he has killed innocent people in the past and spent a fair share of time ambushing groups as a means of survival. It'll come up again later when he briefly discusses the past with his brother Tommy, but I really wish the game had gone deeper, because there is an interesting discussion to be had here around our feelings for the raiders trying to kill Joel and Ellie, and whether we should show them some kind of mercy. If we know that some of the raiders are just misguided, and that some of them could change for the better, or at least realize the error of their ways, wouldn't the right thing be to try and reason with them? What if they drop their weapons, or show us mercy in some way? Should we then be willing to forgive them and allow them to live? These are questions the game never brings up, but they are important just the same because how we perceive those seen as enemies dictates how we treat them and how they treat us. Perhaps the hardline response of show no mercy is right. Why give them the chance to lie and save their own skin if they're just going to be back and killing innocent people next week? Maybe we should believe everyone is capable of change and just trust that they have good intentions, leaving them alive because it is the right thing to do. This would be the more pacifist approach and would fall in line with deontology if we subscribe to that way of doing things. Or it could be that the right answer is somewhere in between, leading us to search for a middle ground that doesn't seem to exist at first glance. If there were a proper society around, a place where laws and a judicial structure dictated how to handle people and their past mistakes, that could provide another possible answer. Though that kind of thing is kind of difficult to find in the world of The Last of Us, since society did collapse. Historically, the right thing to do has boiled down to self-preservation and protecting the in-group. Anyone who wasn't one of us posed a threat, and that threat needed to be eliminated to ensure our future survival. That's a rather barbaric and infantile way of doing things, but it worked for thousands of years before humans started forming more civilized societies. The argument I've seen most often from people, specifically in the comments of some of my Walking Dead game breakdowns, is that society has fallen and there are no moral or ethical ways of doing things anymore. They resort to the idea of survival of the fittest, which coincidentally brings us back to where this discussion started in the first place, and the concept of ought versus is. The is, in this situation, would be that the world exists in a state of kill or be killed, and not taking out the potential raiders could mean losing your own life or the life of someone you care about. It is the hard facts as they exist. And while we could just go along with how things are, there isn't really any good future to speak of if we continue down that road. The ought is up for debate, though. What we ought to do is dictated by our collective ideas and desires. Do we want a world in which we don't need to worry about where our next meal is coming from? Would we like to be able to travel between places without needing to worry about being robbed or killed in the process? Should we be able to lay our heads down at night and not need to worry that we'll be killed in our sleep? Once we decide how we want the world to be, we need to figure out how we get to that state. What kind of government do we want in place? In order to establish rules and consequences for breaking those rules, we'll need some kind of governing body. That could be elected representatives or a community vote on individual issues. It could also be an appointment, where we pick someone to choose people to make rules or to make the rules themselves for everyone to follow. As you can probably tell by now, this topic becomes really complicated really fast. Each and every one of us has our own ideas, opinions, hopes, and desires, and we are hardwired to focus on ourselves and our own well-being above everything else. We can't even begin to think about how society should be run until our own needs are met, and even then it can be incredibly difficult to know what is right and what is wrong in a given situation, as our beliefs and opinions clash with the beliefs and opinions of others in our group. Maybe I think we should prioritize crops and food production because people need to eat. But you think that we need to prioritize building up defenses because there's another group nearby that seems to be planning to attack. We only have enough resources, time, energy, and labor to handle one task at a time properly. So which do we do? For groups like the Raiders in the game, this debate gets shot down and ignored in favor of just going along with the way things are and focusing on their own individual survival above all else. Long-term planning is difficult, and attacking people to get more resources works up to a certain point, so they never advance beyond a basic societal structure. They exist in a world where no higher power has handed down any rules that would force them to do things any differently, and they don't imagine a scenario where they'll ever run up against anyone with the firepower or ability to overtake them, so they keep going. Some of them, like Joel, live long enough to see how wrong they are, but many of them don't make it more than a few years before they succumb to some accident or injury, or one of their fellow raiders kills them off. But not everyone is a raider, and before long, Joel and Ellie find themselves teaming up with another pair and discovering the true danger of the world around them. Wandering through Pittsburgh, there are a couple of moments that really started to bring me into the world of The Last of Us as I was playing the game. The first was Ellie finally learning how to whistle. She'd been trying to figure it out as we made our way to meet Bill, and that dedication paid off as we walked through the overgrown streets of the Steel City. That moment really humanized Ellie and reminded me of when my oldest daughter was trying to learn that skill herself, and honestly, it's just one of those things that, even as a writer, I can't even find the words to properly explain how it made me feel. Something about that moment just hit me and made me want to slow the game down, despite my earlier inclination to speed things up. Directly after that moment, though, was one that got my philosophical senses buzzing, as the subject of utilitarianism comes up when the pair find themselves surrounded by cars and skeletons in a scene that really drives home just how bad things must have been in the beginning of the outbreak. Ellie asks Joel what happened, thinking maybe the raiders had killed the people around them. And I'll just let Joel respond before we discuss.
Your fellow hunters do this?
Cute. And no, my money's on the military.
Why would they mow down all these people?
You can't let everyone in.
So they killed them?
And dead people don't get infected. You sacrifice the few to save the many.
It's kind of shitty.
Yeah.
From an extremely utilitarian standpoint, the actions of the military here make sense. If they're trying to save as many people as possible, and the best way to do that is by killing off a large number of people, then opening fire on those outside the gates is the best way to achieve that goal. Let's say you have 500 people inside the safe zone, with food, water, shelter, and medicine, and there are 2,000 people outside trying to get in. You don't know if any of those 2,000 people are infected, and letting them in means that not only will they die, but so will the 500 you have inside. In that instance, you can either lose the majority of 2,500 people, or lose 2,000 while saving 500. But from a more humanistic standpoint, there is no justifying killing any of them. Most people would likely be opposed to any of them dying and would be appalled to see something like this happening in the world we live in. We would see it as an injustice and would maybe even speak up or fight against that kind of suffering in any way that we could. But of course, it does happen in our world and has happened quite a bit in the past few years. Nations in various parts of the world have justified acts of genocide and war using this same logic, just masked a different way. It's the idea of us versus them that we've discussed before, with leaders saying things like, "We have to get them before they get us." In the early part of the outbreak, in The Last of Us, it becomes, "We have to kill them so they can't get inside and kill us." But that hardline stance doesn't always work out for the best, and we can find evidence as Joel and Ellie move through the streets of some horrific acts that took place as the people the military didn't kill off struggled to survive. One scene in particular depicts a trio of soldiers that some of the civilians killed and strung up as a warning or example, with the goal being to get the soldiers inside the safe zone to give up and give out the rations they were storing. Notes that we can find scattered throughout the city point to that tactic being ineffective overall, though the civilians did win out in the end, and we'll wind up dealing with the fallout of that shortly. After dealing with some more raiders and becoming separated in a hotel, Ellie winds up saving Joel's life as he finds himself outmatched by a raider who caught him off guard. This instance appears to be the first time Ellie has taken the life of another person. And while the discussion of this moment could focus on Joel's reaction, I think it's a little more prudent to look at the weight Ellie takes on her shoulders when she pulls that trigger. Many people think that they would be able to end another person's life if the situation warranted it. But few stop to think about how that action, even when justified, will wind up affecting them. Life is one of those things that we as human beings, despite our modern technology and advancements, have not been able to replicate yet. The very essence of what makes something or someone alive remains elusive to us and has been the topic of many debates in science fiction novels. But while we can't create life, we can, and often do, take it away. Every single person that has ever lived has, in one way or another, either purposefully or accidentally taken away the life of some other living organism. It could be your immune system fighting off and killing a virus or bacteria, or you swatting a fly or a mosquito and squishing it flat, or even a situation where you're out hunting for food, killing something like a deer. But for most of us, those things don't really register too much because they aren't human. Taking the life of another human being hits different because it forces us to confront our own mortality and the fact that we were the one responsible for ending the existence of someone who had thoughts, emotions, dreams, and a life not unlike our own. We can empathize with them, understand that they had a mother and a father and possibly other people who loved and cared for them just like we did. Knowing that an action we took brought all of that to a crashing halt, and knowing how easily someone else could do the same to us, is enough to bring an existential crisis to even the most headstrong among us. In Joel's eyes, Ellie shooting the raider he was fighting with wasn't a big deal overall. He's killed plenty of people, and has more or less disassociated from the action by disconnecting emotionally from the world around him. Ellie, on the other hand, still sees life as something worth preserving, and would be dealing with a whole range of emotions. It's also worth noting here that Joel's reaction is based on coming face to face with his own mortality in that moment, as he would be dead if not for Ellie. And having that feeling of being so close to death conflicting with the desire to remain emotionally distant from Ellie, as he doesn't want to risk feeling the pain of loss that he felt with Sarah. That topic gets way deeper than what I normally discuss about individual characters in the Philosophy and Ethics series, and would be better suited to Joel's Friend or Foe video. But it's worth mentioning because it helps to explain a lot about how the rest of the game plays out. As the pair are working to escape the raiders, who are stalking them in the streets from the comfort of an armored Humvee, They run into another pair of survivors as Joel climbs through a window in a building and finds himself in a fight with a stranger. The fight is short-lived, however, as Ellie intervenes and gets Joel to stop wailing on the man when she sees a boy about her age pointing a gun at them. The man's name is Henry, and the boy is his little brother Sam. They were part of a group that got split up by the raiders, and they're trying to get to a meetup point where they expect to meet the others before heading west to look for the Fireflies. Ellie is all for joining up and working alongside Henry and Sam, but Joel is a bit hesitant. Part of him is probably slow to trust what they're saying, as you can never really know if strangers you meet are being honest, fudging the truth, or outright lying, but another part of him is likely working as an extension of his growing connection to Ellie. He's starting to grow close to her, with her mannerisms and personality probably reminding him a lot of Sarah, and while a part of him might be starting to thaw for that one relationship, he knows that the more people he grows close to, the higher chances of losing someone. It's yet another defense mechanism and a display of his lack of emotional intelligence that we discussed in the last episode. But no amount of being closed off is going to deter Ellie from pushing, and in the end they wind up traveling together, at least for a short while. As they make their way back to the building Henry says they've been holed up in, there is a moment that really shows the difference between the pairs, and one that is worth taking a second to talk about because of how silly it is. They make their way through a toy store, and Sam picks up a little action figure and starts playing with it. Henry scolds him and reminds him of a rule that they have where they only take what they need to survive so as to not weigh themselves down with unnecessary stuff. On the surface, this seems like a good idea, but it's also kind of overkill when it comes to simple things that could bring a moment of joy in a broken world. One could argue that breaking the rule they have even once could be a problem, but the reality is that part of being human is using self-control and allowing yourself a little bit of pleasure even when things aren't going good. Even the earliest humans, and other modern animals who have to fight every day for survival, take time to play and entertain themselves, and Henry could probably lighten up just a smidge. Henry and Sam's hideout is situated in an office that actually overlooks the bridge Ellie and Joel have been trying to reach, and after spending a couple of hours resting and waiting for the sun to go down, they all make their way down to try and sneak through and escape the city. Despite their best efforts, things don't go as smoothly as they would have liked, and just as they're getting through the gate, the Humvee shows up and they find themselves cornered. Joel is able to boost Henry, Sam, and Ellie up onto a truck that is blocking their way, but before he can climb up himself, the ladder breaks off, leaving him stuck below. Sam and Ellie both want to help, but Henry doesn't want to risk his life for someone he just met, and he grabs his brother and leaves. Ellie jumps down to help Joel, and the pair end up finding another way out, bringing them around to the bridge that they've been looking for just as the Humvee comes barreling through another gate. They do manage to get onto the bridge, but things continue to spiral out of control as they find a section of it missing, with the only way to escape the Humvee being to jump into the water below. This would be bad enough on its own, but Ellie can't swim, and jumping could wind up getting them killed just the same as facing the Humvee could. But Joel doesn't get the chance to really figure out another way as Ellie winds up jumping, forcing him to follow her into the river below, where the raging current slams them into a rock, causing Joel to black out and leaving us to wait until the next Philosophy and Ethics video to find out what ultimately happens. Welcome back to Philosophy and Ethics in Games, the series where I break down the stories in some of our favorite games and ask the tough questions to figure out what is right and what is wrong. I'm Josh Bearheart Hawk, and today we're exploring friendship, community, and loss in The Last of Us Part 1. In case you missed any of the previous episodes in the Philosophy and Ethics series, I've linked a playlist in the description below. As I continue to break down this and other games, I'll add new videos to the playlist so you can find them all in one place. After jumping off a bridge and nearly drowning in the last episode, Joel and Ellie wash up on a beach downriver and find themselves face to face with Henry and Sam once more. They somehow manage to get out of Pittsburgh in a little better condition, and Henry finds himself on the business end of Joel's gun very quickly, as the older man is ready to take out his frustration at being left behind. But Joel isn't going to shoot Henry, not really, because deep down he knows that he would have done the same thing if the roles had been reversed. Henry's primary goal was to protect Sam, and there was no good way to do that while also saving Joel given the circumstances, especially as they'd only known each other for a few hours. Even in the apocalypse, relationships are built over time and experience, and very few people would be willing to risk their own lives for complete strangers. When it comes to apocalyptic media, there seems to be one of two trains of thought where the survivors and their relationship to them is concerned. On the one hand, a lot of people might see themselves as the strong leader, someone like Rick Grimes or Lee Everett from The Walking Dead show and game respectively. They imagine defeating hordes of zombies or some other enemy and always doing the right thing, with helping those in need being on that list of right things to do to a degree. Conversely, there is also a group of people who might see themselves more like Joel, Henry, or even someone like Shane Walsh from The Walking Dead show, doing what it takes to survive and being able to sacrifice others to that end. In reality, most people would be the side characters in those worlds, unable to make the tough calls when it comes right down to it. The fact is that deciding to leave someone to die isn't easy to do. And for most people, the consequences and weight of that action would be too much. But saving people isn't easy either, and losing someone you care about or getting gravely wounded trying to save a stranger would also weigh heavy on the average person. It's really easy to imagine what you would do in a made-up scenario, and to think that you would be able to live with yourself. But when the screams of the person you left to die, or the face of the person you lost in an attempt to save someone, fill your nightmares, things become a lot harder. Along the shore that Joel washed up on, there is a boat that looks like it was either forced ashore or intentionally driven into the sand. In the wheelhouse of the ship, Joel finds a note from the captain, a man named Ish, that explains why it is here and starts us down a dark road filled with hope and tragedy. Ish took the boat out in the very beginning of the Cordyceps outbreak, meaning to ride out the apocalypse at sea and hopefully avoiding the worst of it. He had enough supplies to last a few months, but those supplies eventually ran out and he was forced to come back to land to restock or rejoin what was left of society. Upon returning, though, he found that the world was pretty much over, and his first inclination was to hide out in a nearby sewer drain, a hideout that Joel, Ellie, Henry, and Sam soon discover. He wanted to stay as far away from both the infected and non-infected as he could to make his life as easy as possible. Having others around would mean more mouths to feed, more people to protect, and more threats to contend with as people disagreed on how to handle different scenarios. We've talked a few times in this series about the pros and cons of going it alone in the apocalypse, and while both being on your own and being in a group have their ups and downs, things generally work out better when you have other people around to watch your back. Going solo means that you have to be on your guard at all times, means that you have to do all of the work, and means that you have to contend with injuries and illness on your own even when those things might make it impossible to move. In short, you want other people around as a general rule. After spending some time alone, Ish came to the same conclusion, deciding to invite a family he traded with at one point back into the sewers where he'd been working on setting up a base. To be completely honest, I'm not sure that I would have taken him up on that particular offer myself. This guy comes out of the sewers to trade, notices I have a family, and invites us to go down and become mole people with him? I'm not about that life. But they, apparently, were on board with the idea as our little group comes across what used to be the home of Ish and his group. It's clear there were several children and adults with them, meaning things must have been at least all right for some period of time. They even had a soccer ball and net set up in one of the rooms, though it has obviously been a while since it was used. Ellie and Sam get a moment of fun before Henry shuts it down. And while I couldn't get behind his hatred of toys, I can understand the caution here because the full picture of what happened isn't clear, and there could be monsters hiding out somewhere in the ruined underground area. And, in fact, that is just what we find as we move a little further in. Runners and clickers attack, causing the group to make an incredible amount of noise and expend way too many bullets. And I should just take a second to point out how awesome this whole section of the game was for me. I knew there would be zombies at some point. It just made sense given the atmosphere. But the way it had been so quiet leading up to this moment, and the mystery of what happened in the first few notes and areas, made the sewers one of my favorite chapters. I never fully let my guard down, but I had relaxed a little bit and was starting to focus more on the mystery than the danger when we encountered the first group of enemies. And I can imagine Joel and the rest having a similar feeling. Even Henry, who's overcautious to a fault, seemed to be letting his guard down a bit as we explored, and I have to give props to the devs for this whole section. That being said, the next area we wandered into broke my heart and really got my philosophy and ethics senses going. It appears there was some kind of school or daycare set up, with toys and a blackboard that almost made the area feel normal. But one phrase, written on the floor in sidewalk chalk, really hit me hard. They didn't suffer. But those words weren't even the coldest part of the room, as Joel's flashlight landed on what appeared to be several bodies, most of them small and covered by a sheet, sitting in the corner of the room. One of the bodies, the only adult to be found, was that of a man named Kyle, and a note on the floor next to his body tells a sad and grisly tale. "We are trapped. I think everyone is dead. Some of the little ones are with me. I got infected pounding at the door. I don't know how long we'll hold out. If Ish and the others are alive, maybe they can reach us. They have to reach us. If it comes down to it, I'll make it quick." The infected had gotten in somehow and taken over the sewer, and Kyle wound up getting stuck in a position that no one would envy. He had to choose to either end the lives of the children or let them get torn apart by the zombies. Ethically speaking, it's better to prevent suffering, but no amount of ethical or moral justification could ever make a decision like that easy. To make matters worse, the question of if he even needed to do anything is floating around because there is a chance that Ish and the others could still be alive and on their way to help. A scene from the movie The Mist comes to mind here. If you've never seen The Mist, it's a movie adaptation of a Stephen King short horror story where a small town is overtaken by a dense fog that contains horrific monsters. A group of people is trapped inside a grocery store with no way of knowing if anyone is coming to rescue them or not, or if there's any hope of survival. At one point, a small contingent of the group makes a run for it, managing to secure one of the vehicles in the parking lot as a means of escape. They don't get very far before the vehicle runs out of gas or breaks down, and they have a decision to make. It doesn't look like any help is coming, and they have a revolver with enough shots to kill all but one of them, meaning only one of them would need to suffer at the hands of the monsters that seem to be closing in on the car. The driver, a man named David, winds up shooting everyone else in the vehicle, including his son, before stepping out and yelling for the monsters to come and get him. But that won't be happening, as within seconds the fog starts to clear and the military comes rolling through to save the day. Meaning if David and the group had just waited a little bit longer, they would have all been saved. And this is the same conundrum Kyle finds himself in as zombies are knocking on the door. What if he shoots the children, only to have Ish and the others come bursting in seconds later? Being completely honest, this might just be one of the most difficult ethical problems we've ever run into in the Philosophy and Ethics in Games series, because there is no good answer. If you wait too long, the monsters could come bursting through the door and tear everyone apart. But if you try to prevent the suffering of the children and end their lives, you could find out help was only steps away. And this isn't just a monster movie trope. It's a very real thing that people have to deal with on a regular basis when it comes to medical decisions. There could be a question about taking part in an experimental treatment for a terminal illness like cancer, where there's a small chance the treatment could work, but a huge risk if it doesn't. It might be that someone is on life support, with a minuscule chance to recover, and a loved one has to make the decision to keep the life support going or end it based on a 5% chance of the person waking up someday. These aren't decisions where there is a right or wrong answer, at least not one that you can know ahead of time, but they are decisions that real people have to live with. It's a question of beating the odds, and knowing that some people do seem to have miracles happen to them. In the case of Kyle, the children, Ish, and the rest of the sewer group, though, the odds weren't in their favor, and there was no miracle. We'll find out in short order that just about everyone died, and things don't get any easier as we push on through the tunnels. Joel and Sam wind up getting separated from Ellie and Henry, meaning they all have to learn how to work together with someone they aren't familiar with if they want to survive. Sneaking through the dark tunnels of the sewer, Joel and Sam have to deal with some stalkers as they try to find a way back to Henry and Ellie. These more ambush-prone zombies make the game feel very horror-like, which pulled me in a way that other portions hadn't. The Last of Us isn't inherently a horror game, despite the monsters and setting, but it still managed to give me that unsettling feeling that most horror games and movies fail to deliver on. There is an unease brought about by the spaces, sound, and deliberate placement of enemies that just really hit perfectly with me, and I wish more games would replicate that kind of thing instead of just throwing massive amounts of increasingly grotesque enemies at the player. There is something to be said about having an area that is perfectly safe, or seems to be, when you expect to be attacked around every corner. My fangirling over the game aside, we get a little more environmental storytelling in the form of a children's drawing and abandoned living spaces before Sam and Joel meet back up with Ellie and Henry. Making a break for what appears to be an exit, the group has to fight off a horde of zombies as Ellie works to get the door to freedom open outside. It only takes her a few moments, but she finally gets it open, and they all burst outside to find a warning on the side of the building that they came out of, letting them know that they are infected inside.
Fresh air.
Look at this.
Oh, are you fucking kidding me? Thanks for the warning on either side, guys.
They have to make their way through a neighborhood before they can get to the radio tower that Henry is supposed to be meeting his people at. And there are some more clues about what happened to Ish and the rest in the form of notes left behind by people in the beginning of the outbreak. One of them is from Kyle, who talks about how he and his family had been dealing with looters before Ish approached him and offered a safe place to stay. He decides to take Ish up on the offer because, quote, he seems like a trustworthy guy, end quote, and while that apparently worked out for a while, we know how it ended. I'll revert to my earlier point about how I wouldn't have trusted some guy from the sewers personally, but trusting the apocalypse would be a little difficult overall anyway. Who's to say Ish wasn't working with whoever had been looting homes in the neighborhood and only pretended to be nice to get Kyle to let his guard down? That kind of begs the question about how you would choose who to trust in that situation, and honestly, it would be really hard to trust anyone at all. It's not easy to trust people when society is standing tall, as we have all kinds of grifters in the modern world. But when things like laws and authorities don't exist to at least deter some of the more illicit elements, it would make it so much harder. Long term, you would need to trust someone at some point if you wanted to survive more than a few months, as food and other resources are going to become scarce. You'll need trading partners and people with expertise that you don't have if you want to make it through, so building relationships will be important. Further into the neighborhood, another note from Ish details how the zombies got into the sewers. Someone forgot to close one of the doors, letting a horde in to overrun the camp, and Ish barely made it out alive alongside a woman named Susan and a couple of children. They presumed everyone else was dead, and painted the warning on the wall to let people know to steer clear. Ish also notes that part of him wants to just give up after losing so much, and that Susan lost her kids in the attack, making her want to give up as well. He says he's going to keep pushing on, and while there are no awards given out in the apocalypse, Ish deserves the MVP award for having the strength to keep going. He's lost everything, basically twice at this point, and is still wanting to rebuild again. It's safe to say that we need more people like Ish in the world. Instead of more Ish, though, we wind up running into the raiders that have been stalking us all throughout Pittsburgh one more time. This time, they're hiding out in houses further into the neighborhood, and one of them is sniping at Joel and the gang as we try to make our way down the street. Taking them out is more time-consuming than difficult, and after a little bit of work, Joel finds himself acting as a sniper to cover Ellie, Henry, and Sam as they make their way through the throng of enemies. As if on some kind of timer, the Humvee even makes a reappearance, and we finally get the chance for payback, as the idiots inside decide to come out and toss bombs at the group. One well-placed shot into a very stupid raider leads to a bomb going in instead of out, and the Humvee is no more. Of course, that can't be the complete end of things, as the noise from the battle brings in more zombies, and there are a few more rounds to send off before we're finally able to take a relieved breath. Escaping the neighborhood, Joel, Ellie, Henry, and Sam all make their way to the radio tower to enjoy a quiet evening while waiting to see if any of Henry's friends are going to show up. But things aren't as happy as they seem, as Ellie takes a break from Joel and Henry's conversation to check in on Sam. Sam seems a bit distant, despite Ellie's attempts to lighten the mood, and it's clear something is wrong with him. He asks her about how she manages to be as brave as she is, and Ellie opens up about how she's afraid to be alone. This is a point that will come up later, so hold on to it in your mind, but the more pertinent thing for the moment is Sam's fear of becoming a zombie. He's worried that the people who get turned have something of their former self trapped inside them, like they could be watching everything going on with no way to control themselves. Ellie reassures him that they're a team and that things will work out before revealing that she took the action figure from the toy store for him and heading off to bed. Now, on the one hand, he could just be overthinking the whole zombie thing because he was attacked and actually wound up being trapped under one of the zombies earlier in the day as they were all attacked in the street. But that kind of existential thinking is just a little too optimistic. It turns out he was bitten, with a big mark on his leg revealed as he lifts his pants leg up after Ellie leaves, and by the dawn's early light, he's become a threat. Ellie goes to wake him up and he attacks her, knocking her to the ground as Joel and Henry scramble to help. Joel tries to shoot Sam, but Henry stops him and ends up shooting his little brother himself instead. Unable to process fully what just happened and being unwilling to go on after losing Sam, Henry then turns the gun on himself and pulls the trigger. Welcome back to Philosophy and Ethics in Games, the series where I break down the stories in some of our favorite games and ask the tough questions to figure out what is right and what is wrong. I'm Josh Bearheart Hawk, and today we're keeping hope alive and discovering the true cost of loss in The Last of Us Part 1. In case you missed any of the previous episodes in the Philosophy and Ethics series, I've linked a playlist in the description below. As I continue to break down this and other games, I'll add new videos to the playlist so you can find them all in one place. As the last episode drew to a close, Joel and Ellie found themselves losing the only other pair of friendly people they'd come across in their journey. On the surface, the loss of Henry and Sam was a reminder of the brevity of life, and the fact that everything you think you know can change in an instant with no rhyme or reason. Sam getting bit was preventable in hindsight, but in the heat of the moment there was no way to know what was about to happen when they were attacked. It harkens back narratively to the moment when Joel and Ellie found out that Tess had been bitten, with the major change being the addition of Henry and the relationships involved. And that is actually a good point to focus on, because while the concept of Henry and Sam representing Joel and Ellie and acting as a reminder to both of them of what could happen if they aren't careful is a good one, the real highlight here is their individual feelings about the situation and what it means based on their prior experiences. We'll start with Joel, as he is the easiest to discuss. Seeing Henry take his own life in response to losing his brother reminds Joel of the feelings and thoughts that would have been going through his head at the moment that Sarah died. Henry was almost old enough to be, and was acting in the role of Sam's dad. And losing his younger brother, who he'd been protecting for likely years at that point, would be devastating in the same way that losing Sarah was for Joel. Obviously, Joel didn't end his own life, but the thought of doing so crossed his mind many times, with Tommy probably being the one person who was able to keep him from doing it. Fast forward to the present, and Joel is actually starting to kind of like Ellie, even at this early moment in the game. She reminds him partially of Sarah, and he's been fighting the instinct to see her as a surrogate daughter despite the experiences that they've shared on their journey west. Seeing Sam get bitten, and Henry shooting himself, reminded Joel of what caring about someone in that way means. You can't protect them forever, and sooner or later you're going to watch them die in your arms no matter how hard you try. So what's the point in forming that connection? In reality, those kind of losses are what make life worth living in the first place. In the moment, it's not an easy concept to grasp. When you're going through the pain of a loss, whether it's a child, sibling, spouse, parent, or friend, or any other close relationship, the only thing that you can focus on is how bad it hurts. You'll never get to see their smile light up a room again, never hear their voice on the other end of the phone again, never hold their hand or feel the warmth of their embrace. But the reason that loss hurts so much is because of the joy the person brought into your life when they were alive. Connection to others is one of the things that makes us human. We're a social species, and we thrive the most when we have close interpersonal relationships to lean into. In the modern world, people grieve in a variety of ways. Some seek solitude. Some look for an outlet like a hobby or work. And some go to therapy to come to grips with the loss that they experienced. In the end, most people wind up healing in the long term and forming new relationships naturally, though the timeline of what that looks like can be different. In Joel's case, he spent the better part of 20 years trying to forget about what happened, covering it up in his mind and refusing to even acknowledge the loss. There was some healing, despite his aversion to it, but there is also another issue that he has to overcome where Sarah is concerned. Guilt. Not just guilt for what happened, as it would be natural to blame himself for not doing more to protect her, but guilt for seeing Ellie as a potential surrogate for her. I can imagine him having nightmares where Sarah is asking him how he could have let her down and how she could be so easily replaced. This is because we tend to see new relationships as taking the place of the old, even when that isn't the case. Ellie isn't replacing Sarah. She is a completely different person with her own life and story, and it is possible to love more than one person as a child. Joel should really be looking at Ellie more as a sibling to Sarah rather than a new Sarah. This would mean opening up to Ellie and telling her all about his daughter, her likes, her personality, and her past, instead of closing down and ignoring her memory altogether. But Joel isn't the only one who has a plethora of complicated emotions where Henry and Sam are concerned, and to really dig into Ellie's feelings, we're going to have to go backward in time. About 3 weeks before Ellie came into Joel's life, she was a member of the Boston arm of Fedra. She'd been training for years, having been handed to Fedra shortly after being born. And while she wasn't thrilled about the prospect of being one of their soldiers, she didn't really have a lot of options. At some point, she became close friends with a girl named Riley, though Riley would eventually manage to escape and join the Fireflies. One night, while Ellie was fast asleep, Riley snuck back into the dorm that they used to share together and woke her friend up so they could have one last adventure before being separated forever, as Riley was being sent to some other city to help the Fireflies in their fight against whatever enemies they had. That is a major oversimplification of their story, to say the least, but deeper dives into the characters is what the Friend or Foe series is for. The reason I bring Riley up in this context is because she and Ellie wind up hanging out at the mall, almost being typical teenagers in a way, and after what could have been one of the most fun nights of their lives, they both get bitten by infected. They have a short discussion about what to do, with Riley offering up a couple of options, and in the end, Riley succumbs to the bite while Ellie lives. This would be a special kind of hell for even the oldest, wisest, and most mature in the population. But Ellie has to go through it as a teenager, and somehow never really wavers on screen. See, when you lose someone in a tragic way like that, especially when you were also wounded, there's a psychological effect known as survivor's guilt that comes into play. It's the feeling of, why did they die while I lived? In the best of circumstances, this can lead to mental breakdowns and worse. But Ellie's situation is especially unique because the bite that she and Riley both suffered was, as far as they knew, 100% fatal to everyone. Ellie would have to not only question why she lived when Riley died, but she would also have to wonder why she was special enough to live when literally everyone else that she had seen bitten over the years died. And this brings us back to Sam. Ellie obviously didn't find out Sam had been bitten prior to him turning, but the effect would have been the same, as she would recognize the fact that yet another person fell victim to something that she was immune to. She'd seen it with Tess as well, but she and Sam had actually been getting along and were around the same age, meaning there was a connection there that was almost similar to what she had with Riley. That guilt would be magnified when Henry shot himself, as she knows there's a possibility of a cure inside her, and if they had only managed to get to the Fireflies sooner, they might have been able to save Sam and people like him, meaning Henry wouldn't have had to go through the pain of losing his brother. Those thoughts and emotions don't necessarily make logical sense, as there would have been nothing realistically that could have been done for Sam. But grief is seldom logical. Then there's the fear and worry that she would be feeling for Joel, as this is the second time on their journey that someone has been bitten during a wild yet routine moment. What would she do if Joel got bit next? He seems capable, but so did Tess, and even Henry and Sam. And that would bring her right back around to feeling guilty. How is it that she is immune when no one else is? Did she do something special to deserve immunity? Or is it maybe some kind of curse that she is living through where she has to watch everyone else die around her, forcing her into the solitude that Joel so readily embraced in his life? She mentioned to Sam the night before he died that her biggest fear was winding up alone, and being immune when everyone else wasn't could mean that fear would become a reality. What if she wasn't just immune to bites, but what if she couldn't die? That sounds crazy, but so does the suggestion that someone could become infected with cordyceps and not turn into a monster. She might be destined to wind up alone no matter what she does, with no way to escape. I'm reminded of a line from one of my favorite movies of all time, The Man from Earth. It's a story about a man who was born in the distant past, being a part of an early group of humans, but who wound up living into the modern day rather than dying at the end of what most would consider a natural life. The majority of the movie takes place inside his cabin, with him telling the story of his life to an incredulous group of his colleagues as they throw him a retirement party before he moves on to start another identity somewhere new. I would highly recommend checking it out if you get the chance. But there is a moment when one of the characters asks him if he might be a vampire, even an unknowing one, that siphons life from those around him in order to stay young. It's an interesting thought, and one that would be a bit difficult to prove or disprove, but I imagine Ellie might start to wonder about something similar if she lives long enough. To make matters even worse, she wouldn't be alone in that line of thinking, as everyone who knew that she was immune and who had lost someone to a bite would feel a level of animosity toward her and even jealousy. Some of that might even be a little warranted, as Fedra, for instance, shoots people who are infected as soon as they get bit. Ellie's immunity would raise questions about how many others might have been immune but had just not been allowed to survive long enough to find out. Just to summarize, because I know that's a lot, Ellie would feel sad about losing Sam, guilty because she's immune and he wasn't, and because she hadn't made it to the Fireflies in time to have a cure made to save him, and she would wonder about what it is that makes her special enough to be immune when so many others die from bites or are executed. But her immunity and the questions surrounding it will have to wait a bit, as Joel and Ellie finally reach their first real destination in their westward trip on the Oregon Trail. Arriving on the outskirts of Jackson, Wyoming, Joel and Ellie have to get around a dam before finally coming face to face with Joel's brother Tommy. I found it kind of funny the first time I came to this scene because Joel had mentioned earlier in the game that the last thing Tommy had said to him was that he never wanted to see him again. And then he actually comes out and hugs Joel as soon as he realizes who it is. That might be an example of growth on Tommy's part, or just the realization that he'd missed his brother despite the older man's shortcomings, but we don't have enough information on who Tommy was before to make that call. And before you comment and tell me that we have all kinds of lore and information from part 2 in the HBO show, I know those things exist, but we're taking this whole thing one video at a time. Not everyone has played the game or both parts, and not everyone has seen the show, so just be patient and try to practice self-control as we dig into the story here. Tommy has managed to do pretty well for himself, and he appears to be a sort of leader in a decent-sized community in the town of Jackson. They've managed to get the hydraulic dam working, and have been using it to provide electricity, though there's been some recent problems and it isn't doing so hot as Joel and Ellie arrive. Thankfully, Tommy's guys are able to get the plant back up and running, as he and Joel stop by to check on the progress, and it's actually really cool to see a scene like that in an apocalyptic game, as so many games, movies, and TV shows in this genre like to pretend that once society falls, it's just completely over. That's a topic I've addressed a few times, so I won't get too deep into it here. But I will say that this moment, and the later overview of Jackson in general, is where I really started to like The Last of Us as a story. It shows that even within the narrative of Joel and Ellie trying to find the Fireflies, there is more going on, and gives us the opening for a topic of conversation that will become vitally important in the finale of this series. Before we can get there, though, Joel and Tommy have a discussion about Ellie and her immunity to the cordyceps fungus, and Joel asks Tommy to take Ellie off his hands. A bandit attack winds up interrupting their conversation, but this overall moment, combined with another moment a few minutes later, really put Joel on my shit list. Going back to the earlier conversation about Joel and how he views Ellie, it's kind of understandable in a way that he would want to distance himself from her. He's scared of getting too close and going through what he went through with Sarah. But that isn't an excuse for treating Ellie as nothing more than a package to be delivered. No one should be that emotionally stinted, and Joel needs to grow up and start acting like an adult. The fact that he would spend so much time escorting Ellie across the country, traveling thousands of miles and overcoming hundreds of obstacles along the way, only to then want to abandon her at the first chance, frustrated me more than any game I've played in this series has managed to do. And that's actually a compliment to the writers here. I've picked apart several games at this point, and in most of them I've found gripes with the writing or the way that characters were portrayed in a poor light when it didn't make sense, but this game actually impressed me. I'm not mad at the writing, I'm mad at Joel, which is a testament to what The Last of Us has been able to do when it comes to character building. I actually like Ellie. I can relate to her and see flashes of my own daughters in her, the way that Joel can see flashes of Sarah. Because of that, it pisses me off to hear Joel trying to get away from her, because in my mind, I want to protect her and see her grow and thrive. The idea that this guy, who I've been ostensibly controlling but not making decisions for, would feel differently from me, would not be an extension of how I feel in this moment, is wild. He's lost any trace of humanity, or at least buried it deep within himself, and he's someone that I would imagine butting heads with if we met in the world of the game. And that feeling was only exacerbated when Joel and Ellie were reunited after the bandit attack, with her nearly hyperventilating to tell him what was going on in her mind and how scared she was. He seemed to show some concern for her, before turning around a few minutes later and telling her that he was leaving when they caught up with her at the farmhouse. Now, to be fair, Joel does have a lot of unfamiliar emotions floating around in his head. He actually cares about her and wants to see her safe. But at the same time, he also wants to disconnect and distance himself from her. He winds up sticking with her in the end, but the whiplash I got from his back and forth with her makes my neck hurt to this very day. One minute, he's concerned and showing it. The next, he's emotionally distant and ready to abandon her. Then, he's emotionally engaged but angry with her. And then, he's forgiving her and kind again. To complete the moment before we move on, Ellie steals a horse and Joel and Tommy have to track her down. They manage to locate her in an old farmhouse where Ellie once again shows how much more emotionally mature she is than Joel, as she tears into his emotional wall with several sticks of dynamite before dropping a nuke by telling him that she isn't Sarah.
What are you so afraid of? That I'm gonna end up like Sam? I can't get infected. I can take care of myself.
How many close calls have we had?
Well, we seem to be doing all right so far.
And now you'll be doing even better with Tommy.
Not her, you know.
What?
Maria told me about Sarah.
Ellie?
You are treading on some mighty thin ice here.
I'm sorry about your daughter, Joel, but I have lost people too.
You have no idea what loss is.
Everyone I have cared for has either died or left me. Everyone fucking except for you. So don't tell me that I would be safer with someone else, because the truth is I would just be more scared.
You're right. You're not my daughter. And I sure as hell ain't your dad.
I found myself nearly in tears as Ellie poured her heart out, only to have Joel stomp on it. And I wanted to slap him silly with the controller. Tommy bursts in just as the tension is at a crescendo, letting them know that there are yet more bandits to deal with. And after taking care of that problem, the group mounted their horses and headed back to Jackson. Thankfully, Joel isn't as thick as he seems, and the ride back gave him time to reconsider his plans. As they got to the hill overlooking the town, he ordered Ellie to dismount her horse and give it back to Tommy, so she and Joel could take the horse he was riding to the University of Eastern Colorado to meet up with the Fireflies. This action on its own isn't enough to make up for the harsh words he used with Ellie at the farm, or for his willingness to hand her off to Tommy, but it's a start. The only real saving grace here for Joel is that Ellie is smart enough to know that people will often spew hateful and mean words when they are angry, and she doesn't take what he said to heart, even as she would be justified for wanting to stay far away from him. The whole situation at the University of Eastern Colorado deserves a video of its own, but for the purposes of this video, there isn't a lot to focus on. The place is abandoned, with a few zombies and some monkeys running around. But there are no Fireflies to be found because they fled at some point. Thankfully, an expositional doctor left behind a recording to let us know that the remaining Fireflies from the university fled to Salt Lake City. And we would be heading there right away if not for yet another group of raiders showing up to try and kill us, and I'm starting to wonder if these guys are tracking us via GPS. This might not be super important at the moment, but just keep in mind for next week that the raiders shot first. The encounter might not really stand out as anything other than just another fight, if not for Joel making the single biggest mistake of his life and reaching for a door handle. A raider exploded through the door before Joel could open it. And as he attacked, he pushed both himself and Joel through a railing and onto the floor 20 feet below, where Joel was impaled on a piece of rebar to wait for next week's Philosophy and Ethics finale of The Last of Us Part 1. Welcome back to Philosophy and Ethics in Games, the series where I break down the stories in some of our favorite games and ask the tough questions to figure out what is right and what is wrong. I'm Josh Bearheart Hawk, and today we're reaching the end of a long journey in The Last of Us Part 1. In case you missed any of the previous episodes in the Philosophy and Ethics series, I've linked a playlist in the description below. As I continue to break down this and other games, I'll add new videos to the playlist so you can find them all in one place. Before we really get started, I want to say that while I've really enjoyed covering The Last of Us Part 1, I don't currently have any plans to cover the sequel, The Last of Us Part 2. That could change based on requests and feedback, so if you would like to see me cover Part 2 at some point in the future, let me know in the comments below. With that out of the way, we can get into the final episode of the Philosophy and Ethics in Games breakdown of The Last of Us Part 1. At the end of the last episode, Joel found himself in a scary situation. He just plummeted from the second level of a building onto a piece of rebar, and depending on what that metal bar pierced, he might find it impossible to walk away from this one. Ellie scrambles down to help him, and after dealing with a couple more bandits, she is able to pull him up against all odds. Medically speaking, there are so many organs and bones that piece of metal could have hit, and in all truth, pulling him free was the worst possible move they could have made. Sure, there were bandits all around, and it isn't like there's a hospital to take him to, but in an actual emergency situation where you find yourself impaled by an object, pulling the object out could mean severing arteries or causing further harm. But Joel got lucky. There were no internal injuries to speak of, and he managed to miss his spine and somehow didn't puncture any organs. He also, thankfully, had Ellie there to help him fight off the rest of the raiders, and before long the pair of them are out of the lab and escaping the area on horseback. Joel isn't completely out of the woods, however, and he winds up passing out and falling to the ground before they can get too far, leaving Ellie to drag him into a nearby mall where a roll of duct tape comes in handy to help temporarily cover the wounds on his back and stomach. Once Joel is more or less stable, Ellie sets out into the mall itself to try and find some medical supplies. Ideally, she'll be able to locate something to stitch him up and maybe some meds, but while she's doing that, we can focus on what must be going through her head. She's smart, so she knows the odds aren't exactly in her or Joel's favor at this point, and she's likely dealing with a flood of emotion given everything that's happened recently. Between the events of Pittsburgh, which would still be on her mind even months later, and the fight that she and Joel had before eventually leaving Jackson together, not to mention her fear of being alone, this whole situation with Joel probably feels like some kind of horrible nightmare that she can't seem to wake up from. It's an emotional trauma that would be tough to deal with if she were living in a perfectly normal world where zombies weren't running around. And if I had to guess, I'd say she's probably bottling it all up pretty deep inside in the short term as a survival mechanic. The argument has been made from time to time in the comments on some of my videos as well as other places that surviving in the apocalypse would require things like giving up morality and ethics and being able to kill others before they had the chance to kill you. But not many people think about or talk about the emotional toll that would take and how bottling that emotional stuff up would affect you in the long term. Ellie would be dealing with survivor's guilt from losing people like Tess and Sam, PTSD from the horrific events she's witnessed and taken part in during this journey, the normal hormonal changes that come along with being a teenager, a flood of anxiety knowing that around every corner there could be a raider or zombie waiting to kill her, worry about Joel and what might happen if he doesn't make it, and a flood of other emotions and worries tied to what is going to happen if/when they get to the Fireflies. A little of that has slipped out on a couple of occasions, most notably when she tore into Joel at the farmhouse, but for the most part she's kept it all bottled up and stayed focused on the mission at hand at all times. Even going through the mall, she seems more focused on the moment at hand than the things that she's been through or might go through. And while that can be helpful in the short term to help her stay alive, in the long run she's going to suffer more and become someone that no one wants to be around. Bottling up your emotions and not dealing with the events and trauma you've gone through can lead to problems with your mental health later on, as well as physical issues and problems with interpersonal relationships. The best thing you can do for your own mental well-being is to spend some time reflecting on your own feelings and trauma and finding an outlet for your emotions that helps you deal with them instead of keeping them deep inside. But Ellie's emotional trauma isn't even the biggest of her concerns in the moment, as she winds up running into more raiders. They followed her and Joel, tracking them to the general area of the mall, and honestly, they're just getting annoying at this point. That's partially a knock on the trope of needing some kind of external threat in games, but it's also a knock on the raiders themselves, as you would think at some point they would just cut their losses and run. Joel might have been injured in the last encounter, but even so, he and Ellie took out a metric ton of them, and they just keep coming. No matter how long I live, I will never understand the concept that so many bad guys in games, movies, TV shows, and presumably real life have, where they need to get revenge for perceived slights at all costs. At some point, you have to just accept defeat and go home and lick your wounds. You can't win every fight, as there will always be someone bigger and badder, or at a minimum smarter, and knowing when a battle or war is lost is key to surviving. That being said, they have a reason to keep coming, and it won't be long before Ellie comes face to face with the monster behind them. Ellie manages to handle her business at the mall and get Joel stitched up before getting back on the road. He still isn't doing well, and after a while she winds up seeking shelter and searching for some kind of food. Winter has set in, meaning the options aren't exactly plentiful when it comes to finding something to eat, but thankfully Ellie learned how to bow hunt at some point, and she's able to track down a deer that's just asking to be eaten. The task of actually killing the thing won't be simple though, and she winds up shooting it several times before finally tracking it to a small mine hidden somewhere deep in the Rocky Mountains. The first time through this section, I figured something was up, as things were just a little too quiet, but I wasn't prepared for what was about to happen. As Ellie is walking up to the downed deer, a pair of men come out of nowhere to greet her, and I got some really bad vibes from them right away. There was just something off about them that I couldn't quite place, and even as they introduced themselves and tried to act friendly, I found myself telling Ellie to get away as fast as she could. The men, David and James, claim to be a part of a larger group that has a home nearby, and they even offer to help Ellie out by giving her some antibiotics in exchange for part of the deer that she's just killed, after she makes it a little too obvious that she needs medicine as David starts listing off things they could help her with. Now, this makes some sense as she wants to save Joel, and that kind of desperation can make people do some crazy things. But as we'll find out shortly, David's actions here actually make no sense, and he dooms himself from the start. In case it isn't incredibly obvious, David isn't as friendly as he seems. After sending James to get the antibiotics, David starts trying to get Ellie to talk before the pair of them team up to fight off a horde of zombies that appears kind of out of nowhere. They manage to successfully fend off the infected, and a short while later they're having a conversation around the campfire once more like nothing happened. During this conversation, David reveals to Ellie that the men that she and Joel fought with back at the university were from his camp, and it's pretty obvious he's holding the pair of them responsible despite the nonchalant way that he's approaching the situation. David's group has apparently been suffering over the winter, and he'd sent some men to scavenge a few weeks prior. Only a few of those men came back, reporting that they'd run into a man and a little girl who had managed to slaughter the majority of them. As Ellie is apparently the only little girl in the world, David figured out it must have been her that was responsible, and he decided to play around with her a bit. I could give a complete play-by-play and go through her trip back to Joel to administer the medicine that David inexplicably provided, then talk about how David's men tracked her down, forcing her to try and lead them away before being captured. But what I want to focus on here instead is David's character and actions. See, he is a manipulator who has likely become very good at getting people to go along with whatever he wants them to do. He's also convinced, incorrectly, that Joel and Ellie need to pay for what happened to his men. The problem is, his men shot first. I mentioned very briefly at the end of the last episode that it was important to remember that little tidbit as it would come up later. And now we can really focus on it because you don't get to send out a group of men to scavenge, have them open fire on a pair of people unprovoked, and then complain later when your people got killed in the fight. And make no mistake, the actions of his men are a direct reflection of his leadership. They are acting the way they are because he not only accepts it, but also encourages the brutal nature of being what amounts to a group of raiders. We'll find out in the course of things that he really does have a group that consists of women and children as well as men, but that doesn't excuse his or their actions, no matter how desperate they are. They've also resorted to cannibalism, which is something we've discussed at length when covering the second episode of Telltale Games' The Walking Dead. But there's a lot of missing information here about them that bothers me a lot. For instance, we're 20 years into the outbreak at this point, and this seems to be the first bad winter the group has experienced. We don't know how long they've been together, how long they've lived in this particular area, how big the group actually is, or why they are actually struggling. Cannibalism isn't something that people resort to lightly, and there's only been a small handful of documented cases where people actually tried using it as a means of survival. Generally speaking, it isn't easy to get people to go along with eating other human beings, even when they're starving to death. Even in the most famous case of cannibalism, the Donner Party event of the mid-1840s, not everyone was willing to eat the flesh of their fallen group mates, and many of them resorted to eating things like the oxhide carpets they had with them rather than desecrating the bodies of the fallen. The overall actions of the group to that end aside, we see something even worse as David manages to capture Ellie and lock her up in a cage. She doesn't take that lying down and manages to break one of David's fingers as he is attempting to groom her. That's really the only way I can think of to put it, as he almost seems infatuated as he's talking to her. He offers her food and tells her that he needs her help to convince the others to let her live, despite what she did to his men. And he gets way too close to her as he puts his hand gently on hers. She sees through this bullshit and pretends to go along just long enough to bring his guard down, allowing her enough of a surprise moment to actually snap his finger, and this might have been one of the worst moments in the game for me. I would normally save this kind of breakdown for a friend or foe episode, but I'm not sure I could make one on David that would work as anything other than a further condemnation of him. He's manipulative, underhanded, and a creep to say the very least, and he has zero redeeming qualities. He's also full of himself, and like most villains, his hubris is what ultimately brings him down, as he is convinced that he can manipulate Ellie into joining his group and becoming what I can only assume is some kind of wife down the road. He offers her medicine for Joel as a way to pretend that he is on her side. Then he reveals he has a second gun that she didn't know about and helps her take out zombies, saving her life in the process and gaining trust. Also, he can flip the script and show how much mercy he has, even as he points out how bad what she did to his men was. The medicine he gave her actually wound up being a net positive for her, though. As she's dealing with being locked in a cage, Joel wakes up, having fought off an infection thanks to the antibiotics, and he sets out to find Ellie despite still being gravely injured. It might have been hard to figure out where she went, though, if not for some help from some of David's men. Joel managed to capture a couple of them, and we're reminded of who he really is as he does some pretty horrible things to make them talk. Normally, I would say that hurting them wouldn't be of much use, but Joel manages to get the information out of them by walking a very thin line before taking them both out of the world. At the same time, Ellie manages to escape David, fleeing into the town before making her way through the streets as she tries to find a way out. In the end, she winds up in a final battle with David where he promises to do some horrible things to her before she finally uses his machete to make sure that he can't hurt anyone ever again. As she's finishing him off, someone grabs her from behind. Joel has overcome the odds to find her, and as she realizes who it is and comes down from the panic, he embraces her and tells her everything is going to be alright.
He tried to...
Oh, baby girl. It's okay. It's okay.
Joel.
It's okay.
From a narrative standpoint, we've come full circle. Joel has overcome his earlier fear of getting too close to Ellie, even using the same words that he used with Sarah back in the very beginning of the game to comfort the girl who has more or less become a surrogate daughter to him. But their journey isn't over, and as hard as facing David was, the final leg of this tale is going to be the hardest yet. Finally arriving in Salt Lake City, emotions are running high for our pair of heroes. Joel is upbeat, ready to get this whole thing over with and move forward, maybe even taking Ellie back to Jackson with him to try to make a bright future alongside Tommy. Ellie, on the other hand, is still struggling to deal with what happened in the Lakeside Resort with David. That kind of trauma doesn't just go away, and while she still has a mission to complete, she's going to need a lot of time to process everything, and she will likely never fully move past what he did to her. Despite that, the pair do manage to share a couple of great moments worth mentioning, with the biggest one being the chance to pet a giraffe. That sounds kind of funny, but as they're making their way to the medical facility, Ellie spots a herd of giraffes walking through a baseball park, and Joel is able to get close enough to pet one, bringing Ellie over to do the same before the pair share another moment overlooking the park and talking about what comes after the fireflies. Joel makes an effort to let Ellie know that they can still turn around and just go back to Tommy's, though she isn't too keen on that idea as she doesn't want the whole trip and her actions along the way to be for what seems like nothing. On the surface, that makes some sense, as if there is a chance the Fireflies can create a cure using her blood or something like that, it would be kind of pointless not to at least give it a shot since they've come all this way. They make their way through an old quarantine zone, where Joel finally opens up a bit about Sarah, and Ellie gives him the photo that Tommy tried to give him back in Jackson. And after making it past some zombies in a tunnel and getting pulled into a raging river of water, they finally meet the Fireflies. Well, at least Joel meets them. Ellie is passed out, having nearly drowned, and before long, Joel is knocked out as well, as the guards to the Fireflies don't mess around. Waking up a short while later, Joel is greeted by none other than Marlene, who apparently recovered from her injuries back in Boston and made her way west to meet up with the rest of her group. She tells Joel that Ellie is alive, but that he can't see her because she's being prepped for surgery. A surgery that will ultimately kill her but allow the Fireflies to make a cure for the infection. She's willing to let Joel walk away, despite orders to kill him, and she orders one of her men to escort Joel out of the building before leaving to presumably go slaughter puppies. That last part might be a joke, but this whole situation is so outlandish that I don't even know where to fully begin. Let's pretend that the Fireflies really could make some kind of cure or vaccine from the infection inside Ellie. We'll ignore the real-world probabilities and the way that fungi works, and act like there is some kind of magical ability that they have to create and distribute some miracle cure to the whole world that will allow the rebuilding of a society like the one that existed before the initial outbreak. Even granting all of that is true, both Joel and the Fireflies are in the wrong with the events in the final few minutes of this game. In reality, the only person who should be able to make a call about whether or not to sacrifice their life to save any number of other people is the person who would need to die. Ellie is the only one who should be able to make that call, and both the Fireflies and Joel are taking away her agency. The Fireflies want to do the surgery without waking her up to tell her what is going on and what would be at stake. And Joel doesn't want to give her the chance to make the decision because he's afraid that she'll choose to die and he'll have to go through losing Sarah all over again. She should be woken up and given all the facts, including a realistic explanation of how likely a vaccine is to actually save even a single person. And she shouldn't be guilted into doing anything she doesn't want to do. And all the facts includes talking about the situation at Jackson. See, the concept here is that she would need to die to make sure humanity could go on. But it already is going on in places like Jackson and Boston, with the cordyceps fungus being something people can build their lives around just like any other threat. This isn't something that is going to stop people from living full, happy lives. It's just another possible way to die in a world that is full of ways to die already. The biggest problem here is that the Fireflies can't get out of their own way and are dead set on bringing back a world that has been lost for years. They think that they can create some kind of potion that's going to make everything better, bring back the government, and allow them to go back to the way things were prior to the cordyceps outbreak. But that's just living in a fantasy. The world has changed, and what they need to do is accept that and move forward instead of looking back. For Joel's part, he can't really be blamed for wanting to see Ellie live and have the chance to maybe someday have a family of her own. It's understandable that he would be sad, devastated even, if she wanted to give up her possible future to help make a cure. But he also needs to be willing to accept that decision if she makes it. What needs to happen here is that both the Fireflies and Joel need to sit down with Ellie and go over everything, taking time to really dig in and give her the chance to really think things through. Then, whatever decision she makes, they all need to be willing to live with it and move on. If she doesn't want to die, the Fireflies need to get over it and start focusing their energy on actually making a brighter future for humanity, rather than focusing on the past. If she chooses to give up her life, Joel needs to come to grips with the fact that sometimes the people we love die. And we should cherish the time that we get with them rather than mourn the time we didn't have. Either way, it isn't an easy decision on Ellie's part, but I know that if I were in her shoes, I would prefer to live and make the best of the way that the world is. This isn't a situation where everyone is infected and the cure is the only way society can be semi-normal again. It's a world where people just need to be a little more careful about where they go and what they eat, since the whole thing started with crops. Given the circumstances, though, I'd have to say that while I don't like the fact that Ellie's agency to make a decision is being taken away, Joel's rescue of her is a better option than the Fireflies' insane plan of killing her. At least taking her away from the hospital gives her a chance to think about it in the long run and choose to do something else later on, as opposed to being dead and unable to change that. And the violence of the Fireflies as they fight off Joel kind of hurts their case even more. He's faced with wave after wave of them as he makes his way deeper into the facility, and he winds up taking most of them out along the way. And that rampage doesn't stop when he reaches the operating room, as he even takes out the doctor, who's armed with nothing more than a scalpel. Though I can't imagine that decision ever coming back to bite him. On the way out, he even winds up killing Marlene, who is just as delusional as her Firefly compatriots, and may even be a bit worse, as she's known Ellie since the day she was born, and should have at least some kind of parental view of the situation. I mean, she says the whole thing was hard for her, but she seems just a little too eager to let Ellie die on the slim chance of making a vaccine. I wish I could end it there, but Joel winds up losing any credibility he salvaged by saving her, as he lies to her face about the situation with the Fireflies. See, she was out cold the whole time at the hospital and has no idea what happened. Joel tells her that there are plenty of other people who are immune and that she isn't needed anymore, instead of showing some character growth and being honest with her. And any respect I had for him died then and there. His motivations for saving her were selfish, but understandable, and he absolutely should have been open with her about what happened. She might not have been completely happy with it initially, but she would have understood his reasoning when confronted with what the Fireflies were planning. It's likely she would have initially thought that she wanted to give up her life, but I really do think that if things were explained properly to her, she would have come around and ended up being happy with how things turned out. I am curious to hear what you all thought about that ending, though. Was Joel right for stopping the procedure, or should he have let it go on? What would you do if you were in Ellie's shoes and had actually been given the choice? Drop your thoughts in the comments below. Next week, we'll be moving on from the world of The Last of Us and heading back east to visit the city of Gotham in Telltale Games' Batman. That should be a lot of fun, as there are several interesting ethical dilemmas to discuss as the Dark Knight takes out criminals from all walks of life. So make sure you're subscribed to Lost in Games here on YouTube so you don't miss out on that. If you want to help me out in other ways, I've got a Patreon, channel memberships on YouTube, and a membership program on my website. Signing up for any of those and dropping a couple bucks a month my way helps me keep making great series like Philosophy and Ethics in Games, as well as others like Unscripted and Friend or Foe. That's all I've got for this one. I want to thank you all for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.
I struggled for a long time with surviving. And you... no matter what, you keep finding something to fight for.
Now, I know that's not what you want to hear right now.
Swear
Val,
to
but
me. Swear to me that everything that you've said about the Fireflies is true.
I swear.